Chapter 45. In Trust. One morning, when I had done jingling about with my baskets of keys, as my beauty and I were walking round and round the garden, I happened to turn my eyes towards the house, and saw a long thin shadow going in, which looked like Mr. Vholes. And Ada had been telling me only that morning of her hopes that Richard might exhaust his ardour in the Chancery suit by being so very earnest in it, and therefore not to damp my dear girl's spirits. I said nothing about Mr. Vholes's shadow. Presently Charlie came lightly winding up among the bushes and tripping along the path, as cosy and pretty as one of Flora's attendants instead of my maid, saying, "Oh, if you please, miss, would you step in and speak to Mr. Jarndyce?" It was one of Charlie's peculiarities that whenever she was charged with a message she always began to deliver it as soon as she beheld, at any distance, the person for whom it was intended. Therefore I saw Charlie asking me in her usual form of words to step and speak to Mr. Jarndyce long before I heard her, and when I did hear her she said it so often that she was out of breath. I told Ada I would make haste back and inquired of Charlie as we went in whether there was not a gentleman with Mr. Jarndyce, to which Charlie, whose grammar, I confess to my shame, never did any credit to my educational powers, replied, "Yes, miss, him has come down in the country with Mr. Richard." A more complete contrast than my guardian and Mr. Vholes I suppose there could not be. I found them looking at one another across the table, one so open and the other so close, the one so broad and upright, the other so narrow and stooping, the one giving out what he had to say in such a rich ringing voice, and the other keeping it in such a cold-blooded, gasping, fish-like manner that I thought I had never seen two people so unmatched. "You know, Mr. Vholes, my dear," said my guardian, not with the greatest urbanity, I must say. Mr. Vholes rose, gloved and buttoned as usual, and seated himself again, just as he had seated himself beside Richard in the gig. Not having Richard to look at, he looked straight before him. I sat down between them. Mr. Vholes remained immovable, except that he secretly picked at one of the red pimples on his yellow face with his black glove. "As Rick and you are happily good friends, I should like to know," said my guardian, "what do you think, my dear, you would be so good as to speak up, Mr. Vholes?" Doing anything but that, Mr. Vholes observed, "I have been saying that I have reason to know, Miss Summerson, as Mr. C.'s professional adviser, that Mr. C.'s circumstances are at the present moment in an embarrassed state, not so much to the point of amount as owing to the peculiar and pressing nature of liabilities Mr. C. has incurred, and the means he has of liquidating or meeting the same. I have staved off many little matters for Mr. C., but there is a limit to staving off, and we have reached it. I have made some advances out of pocket to accommodate these unpleasantnesses, but I necessarily look to being repaid, for I do not pretend to be a man of capital, and I have a father to support at the Vale of Taunton, besides striving to realise some little independence for three dear girls at my home. My apprehension is, Mr. C.'s circumstances being such, lest it should end in his obtaining leave to part with his commission, which at all events is desirable to be made known to his connections." Mr. Vholes, who looked at me while speaking, here emerged into the silence he could hardly be said to have broken, so stifled was his tone, and looked before him again. "Imagine the poor fellow without even his present resource," said my guardian to me. "Yet what can I do? You know him, Esther. He would never accept of help from me now. To offer or to hint at it would be to drive him to an extremity, if nothing else did." Mr. Vholes hereupon addressed me again. "What Mr. Jarndyce remarks, miss, is no doubt the case, and is the difficulty. I do not see anything is to be done. I do not say anything is to be done. Far from it. I merely come down here under the seal of confidence and mention it in order that everything may be openly carried on, that it may not be said afterwards that everything was not openly carried on. My wish is that everything should be openly carried on. I desire to have a good name behind me. If I consulted merely my own interests with Mr. C., I should not be here. So insurmountable, as you must well know, would be his objections. This is not a professional attendance. This can be charged to nobody. I have no interest in it except as a member of a society, and a father, and a son," said Mr. Vholes, who had nearly forgotten that point. It appeared to us that Mr. Vholes said neither more nor less than the truth in intimating that he sought to divide the responsibility, such as it was, of knowing Richard's situation. I could only suggest that I go down to Deal, where Richard was then stationed, and see him, and try, where possible, to avert the worst. Without consulting Mr. Vholes on this point, I took my guardian aside to propose it, while Mr. Vholes gauntly stalked to the fire and warmed his funeral gloves. The fatigue of the journey formed an immediate objection on my guardian's part, but as I saw he had no other, and I was only too happy to go, I got his consent. We had merely then to dispose of Mr. Vholes. "Well, sir," said Mr. Jarndyce, "Miss Summerson will communicate with Mr. Carstone, and you can only hope that his position may be yet retrievable. You will allow me to order you lunch after your journey, sir?" "I thank you, Mr. Jarndyce," said Mr. Vholes, putting out his long black sleeve to check the ringing of the bell. "Not any, I thank you. No, not a morsel. My digestion is much impaired, and I am but a poor knife and fork at any time. If I was to partake of solid food at this period of the day, I don't know what the consequences might be. Everything having been openly carried on, sir, I will now, with your permission, take my leave." "And I would that you could take your leave, and we could all take our leave, Mr. Vholes," returned my guardian bitterly, "of a cause you know of." Mr. Vholes, whose black dye was so deep from head to foot that it had quite steamed before the fire, diffusing a very unpleasant perfume, made a short one-sided inclination of his head from the neck, and slowly shook it. "We, whose ambition it is to be looked upon in the light of respectable practitioners, sir, can but put our shoulders to the wheel. We do it, sir, at least I do it myself, and I wish to think well of my professional brethren, one and all. You are sensible of an obligation not to refer to me, miss, in communicating with Mr. C. I said I would be careful not to do it." "Just so, miss. Good morning, Mr. Jarndyce. Good morning, sir." Mr. Vholes put his dead glove, which scarcely seemed to have any hand in it, on my fingers, and then on my guardian's fingers, and took his long thin shadow away. I thought of it on the outside of the coach, passing all over the sunny landscape between us and London, chilling the seed in the ground as it glided along. Of course it became necessary to tell Ada where I was going and why I was going, and of course she was anxious and distressed, but she was too true to Richard to say anything but words of pity and words of excuse, and in a more loving spirit still, my dear devoted girl, she wrote him a long letter, of which I took charge. Charlie was to be my travelling companion, though I am sure I wanted none, and would have willingly have left her at home. We all went to London that afternoon, and finding 2 places in the mail, secured them. At our usual bedtime, Charlie and I were rolling away seaward with the Kentish letters. It was a night's journey in those coach times, but we had the mail to ourselves, and did not find the night very tedious. It passed with me as I suppose it would with most people under such circumstances. At one while my journey looked hopeful, and at another hopeless. Now I thought I should do some good, and now I wondered how I could ever have supposed so. Now it seemed one of the most reasonable things in the world that I should have come, and now one of the most unreasonable. In what state should I find Richard? What should I say to him? And what would he say to me? Occupied my mind by turns with these 2 states of feeling, and the wheels seemed to play one tune, to which the burden of my guardian's letter set itself, over and over again all night. At last we came to the narrow streets of Deal, and very gloomy they were upon a raw, misty morning. The long flat beach, with its little irregular houses, wooden and brick, and its litter of capstans and great boats and sheds, and bare upright poles with tackle and blocks, and loose gravelly waste places overgrown with grass and weeds, wore as a dull appearance as any place I ever saw. The sea was heaving under a thick white fog, and nothing else was moving but a few early rope makers, who, with the yarn twisted round their bodies, looked as if, tired of their present state of existence, they were spinning themselves into cordage. But when we got to a warm room in an excellent hotel and sat down, comfortably washed and dressed, to an early breakfast, for it was too late to think of going to bed, Deal began to look more cheerful. Our little room was like a ship's cabin, and that delighted Charlie very much. Then the fog began to rise like a curtain, and numbers of ships that we had no idea were near appeared. I don't know how many sail, the waiter told us, were then lying in the Downs. Some of the vessels were of grand size. One was a large Indiaman just come home, and when the sun shone through the clouds, making silvery pools in the dark sea, the way in which these ships brightened and shadowed and changed, amid a bustle of boats pulling off from the shore to them, and from them to the shore, and a general life and motion in themselves and everything around them, was most beautiful. The large Indiaman was our great attraction, because she had come into the Downs in the night. She was surrounded by boats, and we said how glad the people on board her must be to come ashore. Charlie was curious too, about the voyage, and about the heat in India, and the serpents and the tigers, and as she picked up such information much faster than grammar, I told her what I knew of those points. I told her, too, how people in such voyages were sometimes wrecked and cast on rocks, where they were saved by the intrepidity and humanity of one man. And Charlie asking how that could be, I told her how we knew at home of such a case. I had thought of sending Richard a note saying I was there, but it seemed so much better to go to him without preparation. As he lived in barracks, I was a little doubtful whether this was feasible. We went out to reconnoitre. Peeping in at the gate of the barrack yard, we found everything very quiet at that time in the morning, and I asked a sergeant standing on the guardhouse steps where he lived. He sent a man before to show me, who went up some bare stairs and knocked with his knuckles at a door and left us. "Now then," cried Richard from within. So I left Charlie in the little passage, and going to the half-open door said, "Can I come in, Richard? It's only Dame Durden." He was writing at a table with a great confusion of clothes, tin cases, books, boots, brushes, and portmanteaus strewn all around the floor. He was only half dressed, in plain clothes, I observed, not in uniform, and his hair was unbrushed, and he looked as wild as his room. All this I saw after he had heartily welcomed me, and I was seated near him, for he started upon hearing my voice, and caught me in his arms a moment. Dear Richard, he was ever the same to me, down to, poor fellow, to the end. He never received me but with something of his old merry boyish manner. "Good heaven, my dear little woman," said he, "how do you come here? Who could have thought of seeing you? Nothing the matter? Ada is well?" "Quite well, lovelier than ever, Richard." "Ah," he said, leaning back in his chair, "my poor cousin. I was writing to you, Esther." So worn and haggard as he looked, even in the fullness of his handsome youth, leaning back in his chair and crushing the closely written sheet of paper in his hand. "Have you been at the trouble of writing all that, and I am not to read it after all?" I asked. "Oh, my dear," he returned with a hopeless gesture, "you may read it in the whole room. It's all over here." I mildly entreated him not to be despondent. I told him that I had heard by chance of his being in difficulty, and had come to consult with him what could best be done. "Like you, Esther, but useless, and so not like you," he said with a melancholy smile. "I'm away on leave this day, should have been gone in another hour, and that is to smooth it over for my selling out. Well, let bygones be bygones. So this calling follows the rest. I only want to have been in the church to have made the round of all the professions." "Richard," I urged, "it's not so hopeless as that." "Esther," he returned, "it is indeed. I am just so near disgrace as that those who are put in authority over me, as the catechism goes, would far rather be without me than with me. And they are right. Apart from debts and duns and all such drawbacks, I am not fit even for this employment. I have no care, no mind, no heart, no soul, but for one thing. Why, if this bubble hadn't broken now," he said, tearing the letter he had written into fragments and moodily casting them away by driblets, "how could I have gone abroad? I must have been ordered abroad, but how could I have gone? How could I, with my experience of that thing, trust even Volves unless I was at his back? I suppose he knew by my face what I was about to say, but he caught the hand I had laid upon his arm, and touched my own lips with it to prevent me from going on. No, Dame Durden, two subjects I forbid, must forbid. The first is John Jarndyce, the second you know what. Call it madness, and I tell you I can't help it now. It can't be sane, but there is no such thing. It is the one object I have to pursue. It is a pity I was ever prevailed upon to turn out of my road for any other. It would be wisdom to abandon it now, after all the time, anxiety, and pains I have bestowed upon it. Oh yes, true wisdom. It would be very agreeable too to some people, but I never will. He was in that mood in which I thought it best not to increase his determination, if anything could increase it, by opposing him. I took out Ada's letter and put it in his hand. Am I to read it now? He asked. As I told him yes, he laid it on the table, and resting his head upon his hand, began. He had not read far when he rested his head upon his two hands, to hide his face from me. A little while he rose, as if the light were bad, and went to the window. He finished reading it there, with his back towards me. After he had finished, he folded it up, stood there for some minutes with the letter in his hand. When he came back to his chair, I saw tears in his eyes. Of course, Esther, you know what she says here. He spoke in a softened voice, kissed the letter as he asked me. Yes, Richard. Offers me, he went on, tapping his foot upon the floor, the little inheritance she is certain of soon, just as little and as much as I have wasted, and begs and prays me to take it, set myself right with it, and remain in the service. I know your welfare to be the dearest wish of her heart, said I, and oh, my dear Richard, Ada's is a noble heart. I'm sure it is. I wish I was dead. He went back to the window, and laying his arm across it, leaned his head down on his arm. It greatly affected me to see him so, but I hoped he might become more yielding, and I remained silent. My experience was very limited. I was not at all prepared for his rousing himself out of this emotion to a new sense of injury. And this is the heart that the same John Jarndyce, who is not otherwise to be mentioned between us, stepped in to estrange from me, he said indignantly. And the dear girl makes me this generous offer from under the same John Jarndyce's roof, and with the same John Jarndyce's gracious consent and connivance, I dare say, as a new means of buying me off. Richard, I cried out hastily, I will not hear you say such shameful words. I was very angry with him indeed, and for the first time in my life, but it only lasted a moment, when I saw his worn young face looking at me as if he was sorry. I put my hand on his shoulder and said, If you please, my dear Richard, do not speak in such a tone to me. Consider. He blamed himself exceedingly, and told me in the most generous manner that he had been very wrong, and that he begged my pardon 1,000 times. At that I laughed, but trembled a little too, for I was rather fluttered after being so fiery. To accept this offer, my dear Esther, said he, sitting down beside me and resuming our conversation, once more, pray forgive me. I am deeply grieved. To accept my dearest cousin's offer is, I need not say, impossible. Besides, I have letters and papers that I could show you which would convince you it's all over here. I've done with the red coat, believe me, but it's some satisfaction, in the midst of my troubles and perplexities, to know that I am pressing Ada's interest in pressing my own. Volves has his shoulder to the wheel, and he cannot help urging it on as much for her as for me, thank God. His sanguine hopes were rising within him and lighting up his features, but they made his face more sad to me than it had been before. No, no, cried Richard exultingly. If every farthing of Ada's little fortune were mine, no part of it should be spent in retaining me in what I am not fit for, can take no interest in, and am weary of. Should be devoted to what promises a better return, and should be used where she has a larger stake. Don't be uneasy for me. I shall now have only one thing on my mind, and Volves and I will work it. I shall not be without means, free of my commission. I shall be able to compound with some small usurers who will hear of nothing but their bond now. Vole says so. I should have a balance in my favour anyway, but that would swell it. Come, come, you shall carry a letter to Ada from me. Esther, you must both of you be more hopeful of me, and not believe that I am quite cast away just yet, my dear. I will not repeat what I said to Richard. I know it was tiresome, and nobody is to suppose for a moment that it was at all wise. It only came from my heart. He heard it patiently and feelingly, but I saw that on the two subjects he had reserved it was at present hopeless to make any representation to him. I saw, too, and had experienced in this very interview, the sense of my guardian's remark that it was even more mischievous to use persuasion with him than to leave him as he was. Therefore I was driven at last to asking Richard if he would mind convincing me that it really was all over there, as he had said, and that it was not his mere impression. He showed me, without hesitation, a correspondence making it quite plain that his retirement was arranged. I found from what he had told me that Mr. Vholes had copies of these papers, and had been in consultation with him throughout. Beyond ascertaining this, and having been the bearer of Ada's letter, and being, as I was going to be, Richard's companion back to London, I had done no good by coming down. Admitting this to myself with a reluctant heart, I said I would return to the hotel and wait until he joined me there. So he threw a cloak over his shoulders and saw me to the gate, and Charlie and I went back along the beach. There was a concourse of people in one spot, surrounding some naval officers who were landing from a boat, and pressing about them with unusual interest. I said to Charlie this would be one of the great Indiaman's boats now, and we stopped to look. The gentlemen slowly came up from the waterside, speaking good-humouredly to each other and to the people around, and glancing about them as if they were glad to be in England again. "Charlie, Charlie," said I, "come away." And I hurried on so swiftly that my little maid was surprised. It was not until we were shut up in our cabin room that I had had time to take a breath, and I began to think why I had made such haste. In one of the sunburnt faces I recognised Mr. Alan Woodcourt, and I had been afraid of his recognising me. I had been unwilling that he should see my altered looks. I had been taken by surprise, and my courage quite failed me. But I knew this would not do, and I now said to myself, "My dear, there is no reason, there is, and there can be no reason at all, why it should be worse for you now than it has ever been. What you were last month you are today. You are no worse, you are no better. This is not your resolution. Call it up, Esther, call it up." I was in a great tremble with running, and at first I was quite unable to calm myself. But I got better, and I was very glad to know it. The party came to the hotel. I heard them speaking on the staircase. I was sure it was the same gentleman, because I knew their voices again. I mean, I knew Mr. Woodcourt's. It would still have been a great relief to me to have gone away without making myself known, but I was determined not to do so. No, my dear, no, no, no. I untied my bonnet and put my veil half up, I think I mean half down, but it matters very little, and wrote on one of my cards that I happened to be there with Mr. Richard Carstone, and I sent it in to Mr. Woodcourt. He came immediately. I told him I was rejoiced to be by chance among the first to welcome him home to England, and I saw that he was very sorry for me. "You have been in a shipwreck and peril since you left us, Mr. Woodcourt," said I, "but we can hardly call that a misfortune which enabled you to be so useful and so brave. We read of it with the truest interest. It first came to my knowledge through your old patient, poor Miss Flite, and I was recovering from my severe illness." "Ah, little Miss Flite," he said. "She lives the same life yet, just the same." I was so comfortable with myself now as not to mind the veil, and to be able to put it aside. "Her gratitude to you, Mr. Woodcourt, is delightful. She is a most affectionate creature, as I have reason to say." You have found her so?" he returned. I am glad of that. He was so very sorry for me that he could scarcely speak. "I assure you," said I, "that I was deeply touched by her sympathy and pleasure at the time I have referred to. I was grieved to hear that you had been very ill." "I was very ill." "But you have quite recovered." "I have recovered my health and cheerfulness," said I. "You know how good my guardian is, and what a happy life we lead. and I have everything to be thankful for and nothing in the world to desire." I felt as if he had a greater commiseration for me than I had ever had for myself. It inspired me with a new fortitude and new calmness to find it was I who was under the necessity of reassuring him. I spoke to him of his voyage out and home, and of his future plans, and of his probable return to India. He said that was very doubtful. He had not found himself more favoured by fortune there than here. He had gone out a poor ship surgeon, and had come home nothing better. While we were talking, and when I was glad to believe that I had alleviated, if I may use such a term, the shock he had had in seeing me, Richard came in. He had heard downstairs who was with me, and they met with cordial pleasure. I saw that after their first greetings were over, and when they spoke of Richard's career, Mr. Woodcourt had a perception that all was not going well with him. He frequently glanced at his face as if there was something in it that gave him pain, and more than once he looked towards me as though he sought to ascertain whether I knew what the truth was. Yet Richard was in one of his sanguine states, and in good spirits, and was thoroughly pleased to see Mr. Woodcourt again, whom he had always liked. Richard proposed that we should all go to London together, but Mr. Woodcourt, having to remain by his ship a little longer, could not join us. He dined with us, however, at an early hour, and became so much more like what he used to be, that I was still more at peace to think I had been able to soften his regrets. Yet his mind was not relieved of Richard. When the coach was almost ready, and Richard ran down to look after his luggage, he spoke to me about him. I am not sure that I had a right to lay his whole story open, but I referred in a few words to his estrangement from Mr. Jarndyce, and to his being entangled in the ill-fated Chancery suite. Mr. Woodcourt listened with interest and expressed his regret. "I saw you observe him rather closely," said I. "Do you think him so changed?" "He is changed," he returned, shaking his head. I felt the blood rush into my face for the first time, but it was only an instantaneous emotion. I turned my head aside, and it was gone. "It is not," said Mr. Woodcourt, "his being so much younger or older, or thinner or fatter or paler or ruddier, as there being upon his face such a singular expression. I never saw so remarkable a look in a young person. One cannot say that it is all anxiety or weariness, yet it is both, like an ungrown despair." "You do not think he is ill?" said I. "No, he looked robust in body." "That he cannot be at peace in mind we have too much reason to know," I proceeded. "Mr. Woodcourt, you are going to London?" "To morrow or the next day." "There is nothing Richard wants so much as a friend. He always liked you. Pray see him when you get there. Pray help him sometimes with your companionship, if you can. You do not know of what service it might be. You cannot think how Ada and Mr. Jarndyce, and even I, how we should all thank you, Mr. Woodcourt." "Miss Summerson," he said, more moved than he had been from the first, "before Heaven I will be a true friend to him. I will accept him as a trust, and it shall be a sacred one." "God bless you," said I, with my eyes filling fast, but I thought they might when it was not for myself. "Ada loves him. We all love him, but Ada loves him as we cannot. I will tell her what you say. Thank you, and God bless you in her name." Richard came back as we finished exchanging these hurried words, and gave me his arm to take me to the coach. "Woodcourt," he said, unconscious with what application, "pray let us meet in London." "Meet?" returned the other. "I have scarcely a friend there now but you. Where shall I find you?" "Why, I must get a lodging of some sort," said Richard, pondering. "Say at Vauxhall's Symonds Inn." "Good. Without loss of time." They shook hands heartily when I was seated in the coach, and Richard was yet standing in the street. Mr. Woodcourt laid his friendly hand on Richard's shoulder and looked at me. I understood him, and waved mine in thanks. And in his last look as we drove away, I saw that he was very sorry for me. I was glad to see it. I felt for my old self as the dead may feel if they ever revisit these scenes. I was glad to be tenderly remembered, to be gently pitied, not to be quite forgotten. Chapter 46. Stop him. Darkness rests upon Tom all alone, dilating and dilating since the sun went down last night. has gradually swelled until it fills every cold void in the place. For a time there were some dungeon lights burning, as the lamp of life hums in Tom all Alone's heavily, heavily in the nauseous air, and winking as that lamp too winks in Tom all Alone's at many horrible things. But they are blotted out. The moon has eyed Tom with a dull, cold stare, as admitting some puny emulation of herself in his desert region unfit for life, and blasted by volcanic fires. But she has passed and is gone. The blackest nightmare in the infernal stables grazes on Tom all Alone's, and Tom is fast asleep. Much mighty speech-making there has been, both in and out of Parliament, concerning Tom, and much wrathful disputation how Tom shall be got right, whether he should be put into the main road by constables, or by beadles, or by bell-ringing, or by force of figures, or by correct principles of taste, or by high church, or by low church, or by no church, whether he should be set to splitting trusses of polemical straws with the crooked knife of his mind, or whether he should be put to stone-breaking instead. In the midst of which dust and noise there is but one thing perfectly clear, to wit, that Tom only may and can, or shall and will be reclaimed, according to somebody's theory, but nobody's practice. And in the hopeful meantime, Tom goes to perdition head foremost in his old determined spirit. But he has his revenge. Even the winds are his messengers, and they serve him in these hours of darkness. There is not a drop of Tom's corrupted blood but propagates infection and contagion somewhere. It shall pollute this very night the choice stream in which chemists on analysis would find the genuine nobility of a Norman house, and his Grace shall not be able to say nay to the infamous alliance. There is not an atom of Tom's slime, not a cubic inch of any pestilential gas in which he lives, not one obscenity or degradation about him, not an ignorance, not a wickedness, not a brutality of his committing, but shall work its retribution to every order of society, up to the proudest of the proud, and to the highest of the high. Verily, with what tainting, plundering, and spoiling, Tom has his revenge. It is a moot point whether Tom all Alone's be uglier by day or by night, but on the argument that the more that is seen of it, the more shocking it must be, and that no part of it left to the imagination is at all likely to be made so bad as the reality, day carries it. The day begins to break now, and in truth it might be better for the national glory even that the sun should sometimes set upon the British dominions than that it should ever rise upon so vile a wonder as Tom. A brown, sunburnt gentleman, who appears in some inaptitude for sleep to be wandering abroad rather than counting the hours on a restless pillow, strolls hitherward at this quiet time. Attracted by curiosity, he often pauses and looks about him, and up and down the miserable byways. Nor is he merely curious, for in his bright dark eye there is a compassionate interest, and he looks here and there, but seems to understand such wretchedness and have studied it before. On the banks of a stagnant channel of mud, which is the main street of Tom all Alone's, nothing is to be seen but the crazy houses, shut up and silent. No waking creature save himself appears except in one direction, where he sees the solitary figure of a woman sitting on the doorstep. He walks that way. Approaching, he observes that she has journeyed a long distance and is footsore and travel-stained. She sits on the doorstep in the manner of one who is waiting, with her elbow on her knee and her head upon her hand. Besides her is a canvas bag, or bundle, she has carried. She is dozing probably, for she gives no heed to his steps as he comes towards her. The broken footway is so narrow that when Alan Woodcourt comes to where the woman sits, he has to turn into the road to pass her. Looking down at her face, his eye meets hers, and he stops. "What is the matter?" "Nothing, sir." "Can't you make them hear? Do you want to be let in?" "I'm waiting till they get up at another house, a lodging house, not here," the woman patiently returns. "I'm waiting here because there will be sun here presently to warm me." "I'm afraid you are tired. I am sorry to see you sitting in the street." "Thank you, sir. It don't matter." A habit of him of speaking to the poor, and of avoiding patronage or condescension or childishness, which is the favourite device of many people, deeming it quite a subtlety to talk to them like little spelling books, has put him on good terms with a woman easily. "Let me look at your forehead," he says, bending down. "I am a doctor. Don't be afraid. I wouldn't hurt you for the world." He knows that by touching her with his skilful and accustomed hand he can soothe her yet more readily. She makes a slight objection, saying, "It's nothing," but he has scarcely laid his fingers on the wounded place when she lifts it up to the light. "Aye, a bad bruise, and the skin sadly broken. This must be very sore." "I do ache a little, sir," returns the woman, with a started tear upon her cheek. "Let me try to make it more comfortable. My handkerchief won't hurt you." "Oh dear, no, sir, I'm sure of that." He cleanses the injured place and dries it, and having carefully examined it and gently pressed it with the palm of his hand, takes a small case from his pocket, dresses it and binds it up. While he is thus employed, he says, after laughing at his establishing a surgery in the street, "And so your husband is a brickmaker?" "How did you know that, sir?" asked the woman, astonished. "Why, I suppose from the colour of the clay upon your bag and on your dress. And I know brickmakers go about working at piecework in different places, and I'm sorry to say I have known them cruel to their wives too." The woman hastily lifts up her eyes, as if she would deny that her injury is referable to such a cause. But feeling the hand upon her forehead, and seeing his busy and composed face, she quietly drops them again. "Where is he now?" asks the surgeon. "He got into trouble last night, sir, but he'll look for me at the lodging house." "He will get into worse trouble if he often misuses his large and heavy hand as he has misused it here. But you forgive him, brutal as he is, and I say no more of him, except that I wish he deserved it. You have no young child?" The woman shakes her head. "One, as I recall, sir, but it's Liz's." "Your own is dead, I see. Poor thing." By this time he had finished, and is putting up his case. "I suppose you have some settled home. Is it far from here?" he asks good humouredly, making light of what he has done, as she gets up and curtsies. "It's a good 2 or 3 miles from here, sir. At St. Albans. You know St. Albans, sir? I thought you gave a start, like as if you did." "Yes, I know something of it. And now I'll ask you a question in return. Have you money for your lodging?" "Yes, sir," she says, really and truly, and she shows it. He tells her in acknowledgment of her many subdued thanks that she is very welcome, gives her a good day, and walks away. Tom, all alone, is still asleep, and nothing is astir. Yes, something is. As he retraces his way back to the point from which he descried the woman at a distance sitting on the step, he sees a ragged figure coming very cautiously along, crouching close to the soiled walls, which the wretchedest figure might as well avoid, and furtively thrusting a hand before it. It is the figure of a youth, whose face is hollow, whose eyes have an emaciated glare. He is so intent on getting along unseen that even the apparition of a stranger in whole garments does not tempt him to look back. He shades his face with his ragged elbows as he passes on the other side of the way, and goes shrinking and creeping on with his anxious hand before him, and his shapeless clothes hanging in shreds. Clothes made for what purpose, or of what material, it would be impossible to say. They look in colour and substance like a bundle of rank leaves of swampy growth that rotted long ago. Alan Woodcourt pauses to look after him and note all this, with a shadowy belief that he has seen the boy before. He cannot recall how or where, but there is some association in his mind with such a form. He imagines that he must have seen it in some hospital or refuge, still cannot make out why it comes with any special force on his remembrance. He is gradually emerging from Tom all Alone's in the morning light, thinking about it when he hears running feet behind him, and looking round sees the boy scouring towards him at great speed, followed by the woman. "Stop him! Stop him!" cries the woman, almost breathless. "Stop him, sir!" He darts across the road into the boy's path, but the boy is quicker than he, makes a curve, ducks and dives under his hands, comes up half a dozen yards beyond him, and scars away again. Still the woman follows, crying, "Stop him, sir! Pray stop him!" Alan, not knowing but that he has just robbed her of her money, follows in chase, and runs so hard that he runs the boy down a dozen times. But each time he repeats the curve, the duck, the dive, and scars away again. To strike at him on any of these occasions would be to fell and disable him, but the pursuer cannot resolve to do that, so the grimly ridiculous pursuit continues. At last the fugitive, hard pressed, takes to a narrow passage and a court which has no thoroughfare. Here, against a hoarding of decaying timber, he is brought to bay and tumbles down, lying gasping at his pursuer, who stands and gasps at him until the woman comes up. "Oh, you, Joe!" cries the woman. "What, I have found you at last!" "Joe?" repeats Allen, looking at him with attention. "Joe? Stay, to be sure, I recollect this lad some time ago being brought before the coroner." "Yes, I've seen you once afore at Inkwich," whispers Joe. "What of that? Can't you ever let an unfortunate as me alone? And I unfortunate enough for you yet? How unfortunate do you want me to be for? I've been a chivied and a chivied, first by one on you, next by another on you, till I'm worried to skin and bones. The Inkwich weren't my fault. I'd done nothing. He was very good to me, he was. He was the only one I know to speak to as ever come across my crossing. It ain't very likely I should want him to be Inkwiched. I only wish I was myself. I don't know why I don't go and make a hole in the water. I'm sure I don't." He says it with such a pitiable air, and his grimy tears appear so real, and he lies in the corner up against the hoarding so like a growth of fungus, or any unwholesome excrescence produced there in neglect and impurity, that Allan Woodcourt is softened towards him. He says to the woman, "Miserable creature, what has he done?" To which she only replies, shaking her head at the prostrate figure more amazedly than angrily, "Oh, you, Joe, I've found you at last." "What has he done?" says Allan. "Has he robbed you?" "No, sir, no. Robbed me? He did nothing but what was kind-hearted by me, and that's the wonder of it." Allan looks from Joe to the woman, and from the woman to Joe, waiting for one of them to unravel the riddle. "But he was along with me, sir," says the woman. "Oh, you, Joe. He was along with me, sir, down at St. Albans, ill, and a young lady, Lord bless her, for a good friend to me, took pity on him when I durstn't, and took him home." Allan shrinks back from him with a sudden horror. "Yes, sir, took him home and made him comfortable. Like a thankless monster he ran away in the night, and never has been seen or heard of since, till I set eyes on him just now. And that young lady, who was such a pretty dear, caught his illness, lost her beautiful looks, and wouldn't hardly be known for the same young lady now, if it wasn't for her angel temper, and her pretty shape, and her sweet voice. Do you know it, you ungrateful wretch? Do you know that all this is all along of you and her goodness to you?" demands the woman, beginning to rage at him as she recalls it, and breaking into passionate tears. The boy, in rough sort, stunned by what he hears, falls to smearing his dirty forehead with his dirty palm, and to staring at the ground, and to shaking from head to foot, till the crazy hoarding against which he leans rattles. Allan restrains the woman merely by a quiet gesture, but effectually. "Richard told me," he falters. "I mean, I have heard of this. Don't mind me for a moment. I will speak presently." He turns away and stands for a while looking out at the covered passage. When he comes back he has recovered his composure, except that he contends against an avoidance of the boy which is so very remarkable that it absorbs the woman's attention. "You hear what she says, but get up, get up." Joe, shaking and chattering, slowly rises and stands, after the manner of his tribe, in a difficulty, sideways against the hoarding, resting one of his high shoulders against it, and covertly rubbing his right hand over his left, and his left foot over his right. "You hear what she says, and I know it's true. Have you been here ever since?" "Wish I may die if I'd seen Tom all alone till this blessed morning," replies Joe hoarsely. "What have you come here for now?" Joe looks all round the confined court, looks at his questioner no higher than the knees, and finally answers, "I don't know how to do nothing. I can't get nothing to do. I'm very poor and ill, and I thought I'd come back here when there was nobody about, and lay down and hide somewheres as I knows on till after dark, then go and beg for a trifle of Mr. Snagsby. He was always willing to give me something, he was, though Mrs. Snagsby, she was always a chivying on me, like everywheres." "Where have you come from?" Joe looks around the court again, looks at his questioner's knees again, and concludes by laying his profile against the hoarding in a sort of resignation. "Did you hear me ask, where have you come from?" "Tramp, then," says Joe. "Now tell me," proceeds Allan, making a strong effort to overcome his repugnance, going very near to him, and leaning over him with an expression of confidence, "tell me how it came about that you left that house when the good young lady had been so unfortunate as to pity you and take you home." Joe suddenly comes out of his resignation and excitedly declares addressing the woman, that he'd never known about the young lady, never heard about it, never went for her to hurt her. He would sooner have hurt his own self. He'd sooner have had his unfortunate head chopped off. I've never gone anywhere nigh near her. And she was very good to him. She was, conducting himself throughout, as if in his poor fashion he really meant it, and winding up with some very miserable sobs. Alan Woodcourt sees that this is not a sham. He constrains himself to touch him. "Come, Joe, tell me." "No, I dursn't," says Joe, relapsing into the profile state. "I dursn't, or I would." "But I must know," returns the other. "All the same, come, Joe." After two or three such adjurations, Joe lifts up his head, looks around the court again, and says in a low voice, "Well, I'll tell you something. I was took away there." "Took away in the night?" Very apprehensive of being overheard, Joe looks about him, and even glances up some 10 feet at the top of the hoarding and through the cracks in it, lest the object of his distrust should be looking over or hiding on the other side. "Who took you away?" "I dursn't name him," says Joe. "I dursn't do it, sir. But I want in the young lady's name to know. You may trust me. No one else shall hear." "But I don't know," replies Joe, shaking his head fearfully, "as he don't hear." "Why, is he not in this place?" "Oh, ain't he though?" says Joe. "He's all manner of places all at once." Alan looks at him in perplexity, but discovers some real meaning and good faith at the bottom of this bewildering reply. He patiently awaits an explicit answer, and Joe, more baffled by his patience than anything else, at last desperately whispers a name in his ear. "Aye," says Alan. "Why, what had you been doing?" "Nothing, sir. Never done nothing to get myself into no trouble, except not in moving on and the Inkwich. I'm a moving on now. I'm moving on to the burying ground. That's the move as I'm up to." "No, we will try and prevent that. But what did he do with you?" "Put me in a hospital," replied Joe, whispering, "till I was discharged. He give me a little money, 4 half bulls, what you may call half crowns, and he says, 'Hook it, nobody wants you here.' He says, 'You hook it, go and tramp,' he says. 'You move on,' he says. 'Don't let me ever see you nowheres within 40 mile of London, or you'll repent it.' So I shall if he ever does see me, and he'll see me if I'm above ground," concludes Joe nervously, repeating all his former precautions and investigations. Alan considers a little, then remarks, turning to the woman, but keeping an encouraging eye on Joe, "He's not so ungrateful as you supposed. He had a reason for going away, though it was an insufficient one." "Thank ye, sir, thank ye," exclaims Joe. "There now, see how hard you was upon me. But you only tell the young lady what the gentleman says. That's right, for you was very good to me, and I knows it." "Now, Joe," says Alan, keeping his eye upon him, "come with me, and I will find you a better place than this to lie down and hide in. If I take one side of the way, you take the other to avoid observation. You will not run away, I know very well, if you make me a promise." "I won't, not unless I was to see him a coming, sir." "Very well, I take your word. Half the town is getting up by this time, and the whole town will be broad awake in another hour. Come along. Good day again, my good woman." "Good day, sir, and I thank you kindly many times again." She has been sitting on the bag, deeply attentive, and now rises up and takes it up, Joe repeating, "Only you tell the young lady as I never went for to hurt her, and what a gentleman says." Nods and shambles and shivers and smears and blinks, half laughs, half cries a farewell to her, and takes his creeping way along after Alan Woodcourt, close to the houses on the opposite side of the street, in this order. The two come up out of Tom all Alone's into the broad rays of the sunlight and the purer air.